Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Steffy no way imagined the moment would come like this, not in the cold half-light of a living room shattered by times of fear, not with her heart pounding so violently she could slightly hear Sheila's voice over the blood rushing in her cognizance, yet there Sheila stood, alive, breathing, staring with that familiar blend of imminence and motherly vision, averring she had only ever wanted love, only ever wanted her son, only ever wanted a place in Finn's life, and Steffy felt commodity in her eventually fracture because she had heard these words ahead, had seen where they led ahead, to blood, to shots, to agonies where Finn lay dying and Kelly cried for a mama who might not wake up, and this time there was no security guard, no police enchantresses, no alternate chances staying just off stage, only the two of them locked in a battle that felt ineluctable, nearly pre-written by times of trauma. Sheila circling near with that dangerous wimpiness in her voice, telling Steffy she couldn't keep Finn from her ever, that blood signified further than fear, that mater always win, and Steffy snapped back that real maters didn't terrify families, didn't shoot people, didn't leave children growing over hysterical, her hands shaking as she backed toward the table where the gun lay, the same gun Sheila had formerly applied so casually, and for a split alternate Steffy saw it all unfold again. Finn bleeding out, her screaming, Sheila smiling and commodity primitive took over, commodity born of every night she'd slept with one eye open, every moment she'd squinched when Finn left the house, every time she'd wondered if loving him meant ultimately burying him, and when Sheila dived, averring Steffy would no way understand the bond between mama and son, Steffy replied not as a Forrester, not as a businesswoman, not indeed as Finn's woman, but as a cornered beast guarding her family, the gun discharging in a blaring crack that sounded to stink the air from the room, Sheila's expression freezing in shock rather than fear, her hand reaching out as if to steady herself, to snare onto life, to snare onto the future she'd always believed she was entitled to, before she collapsed to the bottom, the sound of her body hitting the ground echoing louder than the projectile itself, and Steffy stood there pulsing, gaping down at the woman who had visited her for times, realizing with a sickening certainty that this time there would be no rejuvenation, no escape, no crooked return from the dead, because Sheila Carter was gone, and the silence that followed was unsupportable, broken only by Steffy's ragged breathing and the crushing weight of what she had done, what she could no way undo, the door opening moments laterally as Finn stepped outside, calling Steffy's name, his voice warm and unknowing until his eyes landed on the body sprawled across the bottom, the blood spreading, unmistakable, real, final. And his world shattered in a moment as he dropped to his knees beside Sheila, hands swimming uselessly as if he could still save her, as if this were just another agony he could wake from, his mind screaming that this was insolvable, that his mama couldn't be gone, not like this, not at Steffy's hand, and when he looked up at his woman, saw the horror and guilt etched into her face, commodity between them broke in a way neither of them had prepared for, because Finn loved Steffy with every fiber of his being, but Sheila was still his mama, still the woman who gave him life, still the voice he'd no way completely silenced in his heart, and the desolation in his eyes was worse than any blameworthiness, worse than any laugh, worse than any wrathfulness could have been, as he rumored her name, torn between grief and unbelief, between fidelity and loss, while Steffy tried to explain, tried to say she had no choice, that Sheila would no way stop, that she was guarding their children, their future, their life together, but the words sounded concave indeed to her own cognizance because no defense could abolish the image of Finn cradling his mama's breathless hand, blubbing as times of complicated love and resentment collapsed into one unsupportable moment, the police arriving, the questions starting, the captions formerly writing themselves fatal showdown. Steffy Forrester kills Sheila Carter, and Steffy realizing she had crossed a line she could no way step back from, that indeed if the law supposed it toned defense, indeed if the world cheered the end of Sheila's reign of terror, the cost would be measured in Finn's broken heart, in the distance that settled between them like an implied ghost, in the knowledge that love alone might not be enough to bridge the ocean left before, because Sheila's death didn't bring peace, it brought a reckoning, forcing Finn to defy the verity that evil and love can live in the same person, and forcing Steffy to live with the fact that saving her family needed destroying another. And as the enchantresses faded into the night and the house voided, the tragedy dallied, proving formerly and for all that in their world, survival frequently comes at a ruinous price, and no bone walks down from a fatal showdown unchanged. The hours after Sheila Carter's death unfolded like a slow-stir agony, every alternate dragging with unsupportable weight as Finn remained seated on the bottom long after the paramedics verified what he formerly knew, that his mama was gone, that no quantum of medical skill or hopeless prayer could bring her back, his hands still stained with her blood as if letting go would make it real, while Steffy stood firm near the doorway, unfit to cross the distance between them because that distance now felt horizonless, charged with grief, guilt, and an implied question neither dared voice out loud. How do we survive this? The police moved efficiently, methodically, their presence transubstantiating the home into a crime scene, unheroic tape recording marking the boundaries of a life that had just collapsed, and Steffy answered their questions in a voice that didn't sound like her own, explaining the battle, the fear. The moment Sheila dived, repeating again and again that she believed Sheila would kill her, that she was guarding her children, her hubby, her family, yet every word felt like it was being spoken into a void because Finn wasn't hearkening presently, wasn't hearing explanations or sense or legal delineations of tone defense. He was hearing echoes of every discussion he'd ever had with Sheila, every time he'd hoped she could change, every time he'd prayed Steffy to try to understand. That despite everything, Sheila was still his mama, and now she was gone, taken by the woman he loved most in the world, a verity so cruel and complicated his mind refused to completely reuse it. When the house eventually voided and the door closed behind the last officer, the silence was unsupportable, rough, as if the walls themselves were mourning, and Finn eventually rose to his bases, his movements slow and deliberate, his face hollowed out by shock, and he looked at Steffy not with rage but with commodity far worse, profound, painting desolation, the kind that strips wrathfulness of its power and leaves only anguish before, and he asked still, did she say anything at the end? The question cut deeper than any blameworthiness could have, because Steffy knew that whatever Sheila had been, whatever she had done, Finn demanded to believe there had been commodity mortal in her final moments, commodity that justified his times of equivocal stopgap, and Steffy swallowed hard, her eyes filling with gashes as she admitted the verity, that Sheila had reached out, that she had looked shocked, not triumphant, not manipulative, just shocked, and Finn closed his eyes, a broken sound escaping his throat as he rumored, she was still my mama, the words not meant as a commination but as a statement of fact, a verity that now defined the ocean between them. News of Sheila's death spread like campfire, kindling shockwaves through Los Angeles and beyond, captions screaming about the end of one of the most notorious villains in the megacity's history, pundits mooting whether Steffy Forrester was an idol or a killer, suckers of the Forrester conglomerate rallying around her while others questioned how far tone defense could truly stretch, and within the Forrester family, responses were as fractured as the situation itself, ridge incontinently. Going into protection mode, hiring the stylish legal platoon plutocrat could buy, determined that his son would not be destroyed by a woman who had scarified them all for times, while Taylor plotted to attune her professional understanding of trauma with the unsupportable reality that her son had taken a life, averring Steffy demanded compassion, not judgment, indeed as she still stressed the cerebral risk this would take, and Liam, watching from the sidelines with a blend of concern and undetermined emotion, couldn't help but wonder if this tragedy would eventually pull Steffy down from Finn and back toward the safety of a history she formerly knew. Finn, meanwhile, retreated inward, his grief segregating him from everyone who tried to reach him, spending long nights alone, replaying recollections of Sheila not as the monster the world saw but as the complicated, damaged woman who had formerly held him, who had looked at him with genuine love indeed when her conduct were insupportable, and he set up himself visited by the idea that he'd failed her, that if he'd tried harder, believed longer, stood firmer between her and Steffy, perhaps none of this would have happened, guilt wrapping around him like a vice, tensing every time he looked at his woman and flashed back that she was the bone who pulled the detector, indeed as another part of him understood why she did it, understood the fear, the trouble, the ineluctability of Sheila's preoccupation, and that internal war hovered to tear him piecemeal. Steffy, for her part, was unraveling in quieter ways, agonized by agonies where the projectile echoed endlessly, where Sheila's eyes met hers again and again in that final moment, where Finn turned down from her and faded into the darkness, and she set up herself questioning everything, whether she had acted too snappily, whether another option was, whether survival justified the cost, and despite the solace from attorneys and family that the firing would probably be ruled tone Defense: Steffy knew the real trial wasn't passing in a courtroom, it was passing in her marriage, in the fragile space where love formerly felt unbreakable, now strained under the weight of a death neither of them could escape. The day of Sheila's burial arrived with grim ineluctability, a small, tense gathering attended by many, because Sheila Carter had burned too numerous islands to leave behind a crowd of mourners, yet for Finn, the emptiness was its own atrocity, each vacant seat a memorial of how alone his grief truly was, and Steffy dithered before deciding whether to attend, knowing her presence could be seen as a provocation, a memorial of the violence that ended Sheila's life, but eventually choosing to stand beside her hubby, indeed if it meant enduring rumored judgment and icy gapes, because she refused to abandon Finn in his darkest hour, indeed as he slightly conceded her, standing stiffly at the graveside, his expression undecipherable as the casket was lowered into the ground, and when the service ended and everyone began to drift down, Finn dallied, his voice breaking as he spoke vocally to the grave, apologizing for not being suitable to save her, for not being the son she demanded, and Steffy watched from a distance, gashes streaming down her face, realizing that no matter how fiercely she loved him, she could no way completely partake this grief, because she was the reason it was. As weeks passed, the legal disquisition impended like a storm pall, interviews, substantiation reviews, ballistics reports, every detail scanned, and while the authorities leaned toward ruling the firing justified, the process itself was brutal, forcing Steffy to relive the battle over and over, each retelling continuing injuries that no way had time to heal, while Finn plotted with the public narrative oil Sheila as a villain whose death was ineluctable, because no caption could capture the complexity of loving someone dangerous, no soundbite could explain how grief doesn't vanish just because the deceased was deeply defective, and the pressure hovered to suffocate them both. Pressure between Steffy and Finn eventually erupted one night when words they'd both been avoiding revealed out in a rush of pain and prostration, Finn admitting he didn't know how to attune the woman he loved with the woman who killed his mama, Steffy breaking down as she confessed that she lived every day scarified she had lost him ever, that she'd choose their family again in a twinkle, indeed knowing the cost, because she believed Sheila would no way stop, and Finn crying that understanding didn't make it hurt less, that loving Steffy didn't abolish the image of his mama dying on the bottom, and the fight ended not with resolution but with silence, the most dangerous outgrowth of all. In the fate, both were left facing insolvable choices, Finn questioning whether staying meant sluggishly begrudging Steffy stewing that letting him go might be the only act of love she had left to give, and as the world awaited for unsanctioned ruling on Sheila's death, one verity came sorrowfully clear: the fatal showdown hadn't ended with a single projectile, it had simply set off a chain response that would reshape lives, commitment, and connections ever, proving formerly again that in the world of the bold and the beautiful, survival is no way simple, love is no way clean, and indeed when the villain falls, the consequences loiter long after the final curtain. The ruling eventually came on an Argentine morning that felt too ordinary for a decision that would define the rest of Steffy's life, the quarter attorney publicizing that no felonious charges would be filed, that the substantiation supported Steffy's claim of tone defense, that Sheila Carter's death, while woeful, was fairly justified, and the words should have brought relief, should have lifted the crushing fear that had lived in Steffy's casket for weeks, yet rather she felt concave. As if the law's remission only underlined the permanence of what she had done, because no ruling could revitalize the dead or undo the fracture in her marriage, and Finn heeded to the advertisement in silence, his expression undecipherable as cameras flashed and journalists cried questions neither of them answered, because the courtroom of public opinion was far louder and far lower forgiving, and no verdict could resolve the conflict tearing him piecemeal outside. In the days that followed, Steffy tried to move forward, tried to reclaim some semblance of normality for Kelly and Hayes, smiling through breakfasts, reading bedtime stories, averring on routines as if structure alone could heal trauma, but at night, when the house grew quiet, the weight of everything she'd buried during the day came crashing down, and she lay awake listening to Finn's breathing beside her, wondering if he was awake too, wondering if his studies imaged hers or if he was formerly imagining a life without her, and she abominated herself for begrudging Sheila in deed and death, for wishing the woman had no way was, for wishing love didn't come with consequences this brutal. Finn, meanwhile, set up himself gravitating toward solitariness, taking redundant shifts at the sanitarium, staying late under the guise of responsibility when in verity he was running from a home that no longer felt safe for his grief, because every corner reminded him of what he'd lost, and every look at Steffy reminded him of what it had cost. And though he defended her fiercely when associates rumored or questioned her conduct, averring she had saved herself and their family, those words chimed else when spoken audibly, because defending her didn't mean he'd forgiven the macrocosm for putting him in a position where love and loss were permanently intertwined. Taylor, watching the slow corrosion of their marriage with professional concern and motherly fear, prompted remedy, common sessions, individual comforting, anything to stop the silence from hardening into resentment, while Ridge oscillated between relief that Steffy was fairly safe and fury that Sheila's influence continued to poison their lives indeed from the grave, covenanting that he'd not let his son's future be defined by a woman who had done nothing but destroy, yet indeed he could. And ignore the verity that Finn was slipping down, pulled by grief Ridge could no way completely understand. The breaking point came still, not with crying or allegations, but with a simple question Finn asked one evening as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, untouched plates between them, when he looked at Steffy and asked, "If it had been anyone differently, if it hadn't been my mama, would it feel different?" And Steffy knew there was no right answer, no words that could bridge that gap, and she answered actually, telling him that the fear would have been the same, that the choice would have been the same, that she'd still pull the detector to cover their children. And Finn jounced sluggishly, absorbing that verity like a crack, continuing, because as important as he understood, it verified what he'd been hysterical to admit to himself, that there was an interpretation of events where Sheila lived and their marriage still failed. That night, Finn moved into the guest room, averring he just demanded space, time to suppose, time to suffer without hurting her, and Steffy agreed through gashes, telling herself this was temporary, that love like theirs couldn't dissolve so fluently, yet a voice deep outside rumored that some fractures no way heal, they only spread. As the weeks passed, Finn began spending further time with Lee, seeking comfort in the woman who had raised him, the woman who had advised him about Sheila from the morning, and Lee heeded as he poured out his confusion, his guilt, his wrathfulness at himself for ever believing Sheila could change, and his shame for still missing her despite everything. And Lee told him commodity that stayed with him long after he left her house, that grief doesn't follow sense, that loving a dangerous person doesn't make you weak, but denying your pain will ultimately destroy everything differently you love, and Finn began to realize that staying silent wasn't guarding Steffy, it was sluggishly suffocating both of them. Steffy felt the shift before Finn ever raised it, seeing the emotional distance growing wider with each passing day. And she commended in Taylor that she was alarmed Finn would leave, not because he stopped loving her, but because loving her now hurt too much, and Taylor gently prepared her for the possibility that love alone might not be enough this time, that occasionally the bold choice is letting someone go before resentment venoms what remains. The ineluctable discussion came late one night, raw and ruinous in its honesty, when Finn eventually admitted that he didn't know how to move forward, that every time he looked at Steffy he saw both his woman and the moment his mama failed, and that he abominated himself for feeling that way, because Steffy had saved his life, had defended their family, and yet his grief refused to be rational, and Steffy, her voice breaking, told him she'd no way ask him to choose between her and his pain, that she loved him enough to let him go if staying meant destroying himself, and the words felt like rendition indeed as they were spoken with love. They decided to separate, not as adversaries, not indeed as non-natives, but as two people who loved each other deeply and had been irrevocably changed by tragedy, and the decision transferred shockwaves through both families, Liam still demeaning Steffy's route as a source of comfort, not love, but familiarity, while Ridge plotted with the idea that Sheila's heritage might eventually be the end of Steffy's marriage, and Finn moved into a small apartment, alone with his studies, his grief, and the crushing consummation that occasionally survival doesn't look like palm, it looks like loss that keeps breathing. Yet indeed piecemeal, Sheila's presence dallied, manifesting in dreams, in recollections, in unanswered questions, and Finn began to defy the verity he'd avoided for times, that loving Sheila had always been an active stopgap against substantiation, and her death forced him to eventually mourn not just the woman she was, but the mama she could no way be, and as he worked through that verity and remedy, commodity inside him sluggishly began to shift, not toward remission, not toward forgetting, but toward acceptance. Steffy, too, began her own trip, defying the trauma she had buried beneath strength and determination, admitting that pulling the detector had changed her, that she could no way be the woman she was ahead, but that she could still choose who she came coming, and as she rebuilt herself piece by piece, she realized that crossing a line didn't mean she was lost ever, only that the path forward would be different than she imagined. Their story, far from over, settled into an uneasy pause, the future uncertain, love bruised but not extinguished, as both Steffy and Finn stood on contrary sides of a tragedy that reshaped them, knowing that whatever came next would be defined not by Sheila's death alone, but by how they chose to live in its fate, proving formally again that in the world of the bold and the beautiful, consummations are no way simple, Dylan's no way leave still, and the most ruinous battles are the bones that leave the survivors questioning who they're when the fight is eventually over.